All right. Okay. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the live stream, and thanks everyone for being here. At home, you won't be able to see all the people that are in front of me. I'm guessing there's about 200. So make sure you come next time and don't miss out being here in person. It's a great group of people, and we love sharing different ideas with people who are interested in product. I thought we'd start off with some very quick introductions from our panel here. And then I'm going to share a few insights into the world of EPL, and I'll define what that actually means, just to give some context into what these guys are doing and what's happening across New Zealand, which I feel like has some interesting insights to gain. And then we'll sort of get into the panel and discover a bit more. So if you each want to introduce yourself, we'll start with you, Melissa, and then we can start from there.
Hi folks, I'm Melissa Firth. I am Chief Product Officer at Story Park, which you may have heard of. It's an EdTech company here in Wellington.
Hi everyone, my name is Zheng, and I'm the VP of Product at a company called Raygun. We make software monitoring for developers, so something a little bit nerdy.
Hey, I'm Benn Crawford. I'm Chief Product Officer at Total Learning. We make talent development solutions.
Hi, and I'm Jono. I work for a company called Melon Health. We do something called digital therapeutics, but essentially we help people with lots of different health conditions and try to make them better.
Awesome. And I am Andrew Tokley. I'm a product leadership coach working with product leaders and companies who want to hire and to work more effectively with product leaders. So I've been doing that for the last 5 years. Okay, so before we start, as I told the room, I'm actually going to share some insights that I've gathered over the last couple of years. I've been gathering this data, so I'm like irrationally interested in people who are in senior product roles that I'm calling. I don't know if it's a term, but I'm calling them executive product leaders. And what I mean by that is that they typically have these roles like Chief Product Officer, Head of Product, VP, some senior highfalutin title with product in there somewhere. But the way I'm defining it, and I can't be wrong because I'm defining it, nobody else is doing it, right? So it's people who are dedicated product leaders, right? So they're not the founding CPO, founding member who takes on the role of leading product. It's someone who their entire job is to lead the efforts and maximize the value out of the product that's being built. But that could also be the first PM hire and they haven't got to EPL, so I don't mean that. They typically hire and manage other product people, so they're thinking about the product organization within the company organization. So they're doing hiring of people. They are a manager as well as a contributor in their field, and so they need to think about the professional development of the people that they're hiring, the culture within which they're being hired into. They're not always, this is why executives are a bit weird, so they're not always the official member of the exec team, we may get to why that is, but they could be a head of product who's still at the top of their game, still have product managers reporting to them, and they work closely with exec, but are maybe not part of that senior exec team in particular. And they're accountable for a whole lot of things, and we're going to get into what these guys do in their role, but they're not sitting there in front of Jira creating backlogs and work items. That they're working at a level removed from that. So what's interesting to me is that how far we've come from back in 2015 when people weren't really even, well, back in 2009 when I started on Xero, you could barely find a product manager role. So they didn't really exist even then. And by 2015, there was more awareness as we start building up the meetup. Back in 2017, if you counted all the EPL, which I have, back in 2017, there was only about 30 of these executive level product leaders, these CPO type people doing these senior product roles. And in the last few years, we've seen that climb to over 150, which is pretty phenomenal, really. And it's phenomenal for the reason why this panel is important, because these people are critical for the growth and maturity of the practice of product leadership across businesses and how it can affect change and positive outcomes for businesses.
You're talking about New Zealand only? Or?
This is in New Zealand only, yeah. New Zealand, people who, they might work for an international company, but they're physically in New Zealand. So that's interesting. So if you look at the appointments, that's been growing. So the number of people who have been appointed into these roles over time, there's been a slight dip in the last year. But what's really interesting is the number of resignations has been on the increase. And I'm not going to try and explain why this is, whether it's cyclic, whether there's some economic reasons for it, whether it's just a tough gig and people are realizing it now. But it's interesting. I think it's interesting. And if you look at the net growth, if you subtract the resignations from appointments, then we've seen this real sharp decline in the growth of people in these executive product leadership roles over the last 2 years. So I could talk for another 2 hours on why I think that's the case, but I'm not. I'm going to resist temptation, but I'm just going to leave that there as a fact. The other fact is that 73% of EPL resign within 2 years. So that's kind of interesting. 60% of EPL have never held a non-executive product leadership role before. So they haven't come from PO to PM to something else to CPO. That's not the path that 60% of people in these roles have come from. So that's interesting, and to explore what the consequence of that is, but also the cause of it as well. And I think finally, women are represented 70-30 in the general population of EPL, but the further up you go in terms of the size of companies that EPL work in, that's shifting more towards a 50-50 balance if you filter by companies who have more than 300 people. And again, I can make up reasons why that might be, which I'm not going to share, and because I want these guys maybe to explore it a little bit as well. And after this, we can riff on that as well if we really want to, if we want to get into that. But some interesting diversity questions about the people who are getting into these roles. All right. So the reason I brought these people together was because they each have very different backstories into how they got into an EPL role. So I want to open by asking each of you what your story is. Don't give me in 1993 I was this version of your career history, but like the summarized view of how you found yourself in an EPL position.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
So probably need to go back one step, which is I've been working in digital production for my whole career, and sort of as a producer back in the day when before product managers, actually the role was called a producer, and producers did pretty much everything from UX designs to copywriting to account management and project management, and specialised in UX. But I took a role at the ABC in Sydney as managing digital product development in the digital business unit, and I did that for about 5 years. And that was probably the biggest transition point for me, actually, because that was going from being an individual contributor to being a leader, and having to wake up and realise that there was actually an entire canon of strategy and management literature and knowledge that I needed to get my head around, and went through many, went home and cried on my husband's shoulder many times, thinking I was in the wrong job, but actually ultimately kind of got through a lot of the stuff I felt fearful of, and ended up then getting into the head of digital business role when the time came.
So you would be in my stat of 60% who hadn't come through the product management ranks?
Well, as you said earlier, so I started that role in 2007.
Yeah.
There was no product management. What
Yeah.
there was
My science
producing.
is not perfect on this.
Yeah. there was producers, and I suppose I'd spent quite a long time in service agencies, so I knew about the value of time and effort and making those things count, and doing project budgets and things like that. but actually going into an organisation and being responsible for not only building a product, but then managing it through its life cycle and making good choices about what to focus on within that. What sort of happened at that management.
Awesome. Zheng, what's your story into EPL?
So I started my career at TradeMe in the product team when Sam left, and he was putting together the product team, and that was really, really interesting. It was basically the team replacing him and his brain and his brilliance. And I started out as a designer there, and then a UX designer and researcher there, and that equipped me with a lot of interesting ideas about the design itself was interesting, but what about changing people's behaviors or perceptions of your product? I then went and worked for a bank in the marketing department, which further kind of pushed me into more of a business domain rather than pure design. And then I decided to set up my own digital agency with UX and marketing. So I did that for 4 years, and one of the smallest companies that was one of my clients decided to purchase my company. So they bought my company, and they said, you are making good decisions about our go-to-market. You have a lot of business knowledge. How about come and be our head of product? So I've been there for nearly 8 years now. So.
And what business were you running?
I was running a design and marketing agency.
Right.
And I think at the time it was also interesting because I didn't realize what I was doing was actually product management. Because I haven't held that product manager role ever. But when I was running my own business, I was going and talking with a lot of business owners, and they'll be like, oh, design me a website. And I'll be like, why? What are you trying to achieve? So I was doing a lot of that product management stuff, like, what is your goal? What is your go-to-market strategy? And people really appreciated that because nobody was doing that. So then later when I realized when I got my head of product job, that's what I was doing. I was doing product management for about 4 years with my clients.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Ben, what's your backstory?
Got some similar traits. I did a business degree and pursued that for a little bit to be greatly disillusioned by business consultancy, and went and chased the passion and joined the coffee industry. And I worked for a company in Wellington called Coffee Supreme. And I was very fortunate to join in the golden age of specialty coffee. So this is in the kind of early mid 2000s, and we were right at the forefront of that wave, and it was a pretty exciting time. And so I had a lot of reign there to build up the retail experience, which probably no doubt fingerprints of what we worked on you enjoy now. And what I didn't understand at that time was, a lot of what happened was the nexus in that case of reality and digital kind of tooling to help grow business. And that's an area where I just gravitated towards and found a lot of sort of expression and freedom in. I learned that actually, I wanted to focus on that all the time, that particularly how you leverage technology for business, the purpose of growing business. And I found out product management, that's a thing, it's labeled. I had no idea. And so I had to sort of left shift as I did from business consulting to coffee into product management. And so ended up in the warm arms of the New Zealand government. And that was a great place. And actually I had an idea of there's a company in Wellington I really want to work for, but it's too much of a leap to get there, straight from what I was doing. It was so hard to explain when you're working in a small business and your role is probably many of us experience, very dynamic. And I made up my own titles, because there were no titles. Anyway, I was suddenly looking at my LinkedIn. I can't even remember. It was there were no names for what we were doing because it was such a cross-cutting type of thing. And so trying to explain that to an employer was actually really difficult. Government is a little bit different. So I was able to talk myself into a position there. And but actually I really want to work at this company called Silverstripe. And I was like, I think if I do this and kind of get this on the resume, that's going to open that door there. And that's exactly what happened. And so that's when I got into there. Can't remember what role I started with off in there, but 6 months later, I was the head of product. So,
Well, I know because I've trawled you on LinkedIn with my database, so I'm pretty sure you're a product owner even. Like
Yeah.
it was one of the rare examples of someone who has taken that path from
The 40%.
quite an individual contributor.
yeah, so this is where the whole, it's nowhere near as structured as your graph suggests it may be at all. I mean, it was not product ownership.
Yeah.
So once I got head of product there, it was product management. We had to reframe that because it was so poorly defined. And this is like part of that age, right? And so that sort of got into that role. I was there for a number of years. There's an interesting journey kind of at the end of that one, but that did lead me to where I am now at Totoro. And that, I had a few roles within a few months and ended up in the chief product officer role, which is the first for our business.
Jono, what about your path?
I always kind of like business. That's what I studied at uni. But then there was a global recession and there were no jobs, so I took anything that I could get, really. Ended up doing testing, moving to Wellington, and I was a tester for a while, which I hated, to be honest. But what it was good and what I could see was that it put me in a position where you kind of sit between, we literally would call it the business and the tech team, and you sat in this middle bit where you were interacting with both sides. And so you actually got a really good position of kind of seeing how all this stuff worked, and you were challenging what was happening. Should we be building this? And so it was actually kind of like mini product work was actually happening there. And then I got put on a project which I really didn't like. It got quite famous for not being good. But I played rugby with a guy, and I knew his flatmate worked at Trade Me and said, hey, tell your flatmate I want a job, and ended up getting a job at Trade Me as a tester. And that was the place that was really good because it was very early and you had the freedom to basically build your own career. And that's what I did. I always liked the tester role there was even more that kind of pseudo product person. Didn't have product people when I was there, when I started. And you kind of took on that role. And then I got in the team doing the mobile website, and there was even less in terms of direction. And so I could take on those roles of basically being a product person. And that was great. And then moved from test to official product. Had some great mentors there to kind of help me with that transition, which was great. And then went and moved to another company and kind of headed up a sort of more teams in a bigger space, something done completely different. And then moved to somewhere much smaller as their sort of first real product person. So after the founder. Which I think the tech team had basically begged them, you've got to stop doing product stuff because they were just going around everywhere the whole time. And so, yeah, I've been there for a couple of years.
And that's Melon Health.
That's Melon, yeah. So much smaller.
But your role is like CPO plus COO. I had to check that on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I'll explain why.
Well, I mean, we're small, so we are essentially very much still a startup in terms of access to funds, and so you do everything anyway. And we, again, the CEO really was very busy, and there was space where in a small place like that, as the head of product, you can actually have a lot of influence over everything that happens in the organization. And so it seemed like a real natural fit to sort of make sure that the day-to-day running of the org, which actually is mainly product, was kind of all taken under one umbrella.
Yeah, nice.
So it does mean like the head of engineering reports to me.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of check that bias sometimes when you're kind of looking at what they're working on.
Yeah. I've got a setup for you. Imagine I always used to. My career was technology, then product, and it was awful going to barbecues and people ask you what you did. But I'm gonna imagine you are at a barbecue with a whole lot of people who actually care about product. And you would, or maybe not, and you would explain what you do, and in a nutshell. So this is like maybe 10 flights in an elevator sort of nutshell. Like, how do you explain why you exist in a company? Anyone can pick that up.
Well, I always have this because whenever I enter the country, my role has been the same role for 10 years, which is manager. I don't even try, for the most part, to explain it. I've tried. It's a very difficult conversation. Yeah. So let's assume that this audience.
Oh no, actually, we'll get to the answer you'll give this audience. But if it's a barbecue with friends, it's I'm a manager.
I would say I build software, and then I would think of an example, which I think that person might understand what that might be. Hey, it's like, do a little bit of profiling, and it's like we build stuff like that, but for this space, right? And kind of leave it at that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always an example that someone's heard of technology.
Yeah.
That you can sort of like, so we're behind the scenes.
Anyone else have to explain it to?
If they're like a kid,
Yeah.
and like, what do you do? And they don't understand much. I generally say, it's my job to tell the other people what to do, which is not great.
How does that work with engineering?
But then if they're an adult, I talk about, I help the team figure out what we should do together, and then it's a lot longer. But ultimately, I often use your saying about it's my job to maximize the return on investment, with the most expensive part of the business being the engineers usually. So I usually choose a few more words if it's an adult.
Yeah, and seeing how would you describe it to an audience that needed a deeper understanding of what these people do, because they might aspire to be it, or they work with one and they're wondering if they're doing the right thing, or how do you describe it?
I read a book when I started my proper product management journey, and he said, don't even try to explain, just tell them that you're a dolphin trainer. It's a much better story, and it's much more interesting. So that's what I say. What do you do? I'm a dolphin trainer.
Yeah. Nice pop out of the answer.
I could say I'm Steve Jobs, but better looking.
So good.
I probably would go back to a couple of frameworks that I found really useful in my first product leadership role. And one of them is desirability, feasibility, viability. It's the product functions role to act in the intersection of those things: desirability for the customer, feasibility from a technical and operational point of view, and viability from a business value perspective, to decide how to execute to keep those things in balance. And then the other thing that I think that I do, just being sort of, I guess, having worked for many years in new product development and that scenario that I particularly enjoy, is thinking about your strategic horizons and how your product strategy actually needs to work across those horizons to support your business strategy.
I mean, that intersection is what we would typically say for anyone in product. That holds true, whether you're a product owner or a product manager. Anyone knows that intersection well, but how do you apply that working in the intersection as an EPL as opposed to a product manager working with their team on their domain with their people? Like, is it just broader scope, or are there actually different things you would do to play at the intersection?
I think so. That it completely depends on your organisation, on where your organisation is in its maturity and its product life cycle. Who you are as a leader and your particular skills. But you're definitely thinking about the continuum of that as a portfolio. And I guess trying to coach and encourage teams to be thinking about the actually that where you are in the business model life cycle as a key constraint in decision making for what you should be focusing on.
Yeah, because if you're a PM looking after a team, you're not dealing with salary negotiations amongst your product managers. You're possibly not hiring the next product manager. So there's things that you're doing that are not even product-y, right? They're hiring to create a capacity and capability, but how much of your time would be spent doing things that are less directly involved in creating that value more directly? Like, I don't know if someone else wants to answer. Do you spend a lot of time building relationships with key stakeholders that will result in better outcomes, but is some steps removed? Or how much time hiring, or talking about people's career or their challenges at home and that they can't be present in the building? There's lots of things about being a manager that must take up time. Or
I
not?
think, well, no, I think that's true, but I think it doesn't matter if you're a product manager or any type of manager, right? You're doing those, and especially as you get higher up in an organization, essentially, you have a bigger business perspective of what's happening, necessarily with your business, but also the market you're in. So I think that takes up more of your time, rather than just go hire a person, you've got X number of dollars to potentially spend. You have to kind of look at the whole business, well, especially because I love with the COO thing too, right? So I'm thinking about not just product people in those decisions, but I think that the difference between PM versus the EPL is you have that wider context problem of the org, and you depending on who you are, you're talking to the board, you're talking to shareholders, and those kind of relationships happen a lot more. So you're more of the face of the organization internally as well to those kind of stakeholders as well as those external ones that you might have normally been having.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of managing teams, I mean, I sort of don't think of it as being the person who tells people what to do so much as being the person who enables experts in the team to contribute to the best of their ability, and to look at how to develop capabilities where the team needs it. So you inevitably end up spending time working on the business, and you spend time working in the business, and the trick is to manage, a portion and a time to do that.
And I want to move on to like some of I think it's a really tough job, right? Certainly the times I've done it, I found it challenging in different ways and rewarding. But like I want you to dive into what makes it different. Like if someone has it, they report to a CPO and they go, oh, I never see them. They're useless. Like trying to help the room of people who might report to these people understand where your challenges lie. And this will be different for every company, but I'm interested to explore where you're having to lean in to make a difference that might be not as visible to other parts of the business in your role that they might not understand is required.
I'll take exception that if you're reporting into someone who never sees you, something's really wrong. Because the way I think this is what you do is, particularly any function that your point is, if you're at that level, a big part of what you're thinking about is the design of the apparatus and how you derive value out of it. It's that person's responsibility to maximize that value. And if you have someone that's reporting into you, which you don't actually have contact with, and their failure, that's your failure as the architect of whatever that is, because something's not right there. Everyone who comes into me, there's an expressed reason why it's me and not someone else. Because there's, the way that we approach it is trying to maximize what people's strengths are, and also the nature of the roles are specific. Like there's a point for everything. We have commonality amongst them. We have a framework underneath us that helps us inform when we lead to index on certain things. But when we create a role, we should have missions for every role, and therefore your line of accountability or leadership should be very clear and should serve that function. So I would challenge that to say there's probably a dysfunction in there.
Well, okay, what about they see them a lot? They see them every week, but they still don't know what the hell they do.
Then we've got another dysfunction. The other thing that I would say you're probably doing at that level is you're bringing clarity.
Well, speaking in your experience, have you ever been misunderstood in your role as
all the time?
And what are they misunderstanding about?
Because there's so many opinions about what product is. And this is the reason why you can't explain it at the barbecue, and it's a lot easier with the dolphin trainer line, is because that's much easier. Because what you're talking about is you're saying, you're describing I wear blue. And it's okay, cool. But then which blue? Now get into that conversation, start explaining, well, in this light, it's going to look like this color, royal, da-da-da-da. Oh, okay, is that a lot like this color? And then you get into this weird abstracted conversation very quickly, and you're trying to get particular, right? So I think, in my experience, the direction and clarity for the organization about what this unit, which is actually typically very expensive, how does that contribute to the value creation exercise of whatever your business is in? And depending on the model that you have, whether it's a revenue generating product directly or in a product sense, or whether you're a product revenue enabling kind of function, you've got to help the businesses on its journey to wherever it's going, whatever part of the cycle that it might be, clarify the story and narrative so that people can be galvanized around what kind of value needs to be created and then the path of how you're going to get there.
Has anyone else experienced that lack of understanding of the value proposition of your role?
Not really. I think sometimes misunderstandings or can arise because back to the thing about product can be so many different things in different seasons, and things can change quite rapidly. So you might have somebody looking at you for something which theoretically is a job of product, but actually there's a really crucial aspect of product that you're still focusing on, back over here. I mean, I've been at Storypart for 2 years, and I think we've got, nearly 2 years, we've had seasons actually during that time where, first season was actually, and when something we haven't talked about is when you're an executive product leader, you're actually contributing as a member of the executive team. So it's not just about the vertical product portfolio you're building, it's also about how you are managing the entire system of how you create value, and all of the people within it. And so first season was about setting the strategic direction for the company and how we were going to scale and how we were going to grow. Then last year there was a lot of high performing teams and kind of diagnosing where the system actually needed something. And then this year it's sort of getting more into commercialization and really ramping up. And so at any given time, somebody might be wanting something else from you, but it's not the right time for that.
So that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Like that. I feel like you all must have been in situations where, and I find myself, the further away I get from product and engineering, the actual craft, the easier it seems. Yeah, because it's just a web page, it's just a button. Well, how could that take 6 months? And so you're working at that level of abstraction sometimes, and you're certainly working alongside people in other functions who have no idea of the complexity of building software. And I wonder how you deal with helping them understand it's not as easy as it looks, but yet still make them feel like you're on their side and that you're championing their desire to get stuff done faster and quicker. Can't believe that you don't all face that challenge.
Oh no,
Yeah.
That's so real.
Yeah.
So real.
What do you do? How do we solve that? What strategies have you used to try and help?
I think what you're trying to say is the hardest part of the job is saying no, but in a way that everybody feels good about, or don't come back to you. At least.
I would frame it as I've got this whole theory about never saying no, but even if that's the outcome, but the whole reality is you can't do what everyone asks. Mm-hmm. So something has to give, and you say no, but in a nice way. And especially if you're in an added situation as your partner is also the CEO and founder, and so it's not just the founder pressure you've got, but you've got a whole other dynamic of trying to manage expectations and maintain a professional relationship as well. How do you broker someone who probably knows exactly what they would do if they were writing the code, but they've lost sight of the complexity involved?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, so I won't say it's not a challenge. But since my partner is probably watching the video, I'll just be diplomatic. No, it's absolutely. I think the hardest part is saying no to different people, but especially wrangling the CEO. I think if you're head of product, that relationship is just critical. And I love that article that you shared a while ago about how head of product always fails.
Yeah.
And there's a very good reason for that. And it's that relationship with the CEO is just so critical. And in my situation, it actually works out quite well because my partner trusts me, and we talk a lot, and that alignment is always reinforced on a daily basis. But I do wonder, like with other people, especially if your CEO were busy or overseas, how do you keep, that relationship with them and alignment?
Yeah, I think this is where it's easy for things to be misunderstood, I think, because particularly if you've been through CEO changes, and they all have their context of software, and this is again why we're using these one term to actually refer to such a flippin' wide definition of what it actually is and what the characteristics of these things are and how you approach doing that. And depending on what kind of space you're in, I think, at least for me, one of the things that I've sort of focused on has been understanding the character and nature of the technology itself is a really important part of like how to balance out your value decision. Because if not, you're asked, let's make the boat go faster. And it's like, this boat has actually wheels. It's not a boat, it's a car. But it's like, oh yeah, but my other job, it was a boat. And it's like, yeah, but that's not what we have here. And that discussion, when you're actually thinking about, how do you maneuver that? Particularly if you've got a technology that's been around for a while. I was making this comment to you before, I think. When it's all fresh and clean, it's like totally different. When you have like inertia and weight into what you're doing, totally different. And I think the decisions and the skills and the kind of conversations you're going to have and what the true cost of ownership is going to be of what you're doing and what you need to then factor into your value creation activity, that is quite a different equation, because how exposing the value of that, actually I think I was talking with you about this, I think, in terms of like how you fit that on a P&L. Or you actually can't draw a line back to the P&L of that because a lot of it's avoidance of a future issue, or it's an improvement of the way you might work. But there's no A/B test on that work. You don't keep everything kind of like suboptimal and then optimize just one part to go, see? Like, that's just not how it works. So those discussions become quite very esoteric. And that's where I think you've got to align on the discussion about us as a unit, keeping it at the right pitch so that we can talk about what we need to move towards, when we need to move towards it, what kind of inputs we put into that. But I think this is part of what the function is meant to do. That's how the sausage is made. You've got to just kind of expose the right parts of that at the right time, and not, at least what I've found, especially as your organization gets larger, the goal is not to build clarity for everyone on all the detail of what goes into it, because I just don't think that's an achievable goal. Once you're running at the beginning, sure, but once you're there, there's just so much to the stuff. You've got to focus on the right thing and the right time. And I think that's probably the deciding factor of like what's the difference between if you're just looking at a PM of a thing to when you're looking at the whole and trying to account for everything. There's so much complexity that this is the art of it. It's like, what are we picking now? What is the issue? What will actually be a thing for it to focus on, and make sure we don't go down a rabbit hole of, well, why can't we go this? I heard or read this book or saw XY company, they were able to achieve this. Why can't we do that? Those sorts of levels of discussion aren't very productive because, they're pretty surface at the end of the day.
And John, are you working probably in the smallest organization? Is there the founder effect I wonder if you've felt that, or whether the company's gone through founders. I don't know much about Mellon Health, and that can be a challenge for a CPO level person coming on, taking over the baby of somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to say that the biggest thing about being in a smaller organization when you're in this level is you're influencing that founder in terms of trying to educate them about what product is and about how, hey, we could do this way better. Than what you've kind of always done. So I think the first little while was a lot of basically like just hands off the engineers and kind of building enough trust that this CEO founder would basically I go, cool. Like she said to me once, I don't have to worry about product anymore. This is great. And I was like, cool. We've kind of got to that point now where product can kind of happen without that founder effect of, because she would turn up people's desks, right, and be like, do a thing, and then they kind of like look at me like, should I do the thing? And I'm like, no, don't do the thing. But I could then go talk to her and be like, you know, I told her not to do the thing, or whatever it is. But I think it's it's kind of, you have to create the product culture, and if it's not there, that's a big sort of boundary that you have to push through, because you know, if there's just been because they say so, that's very different to what do you think we should do?
Yeah.
You know, it's a very different kind of, you know, what's the problem we're going to fix? So,
So if we put the shoe on the other foot now and think about the founder or the exec of a company who's thinking pre-CPO, pre-EPL, thinking, man, I wonder if I need one of these people. I saw that live stream from ProductTank the other day, and I was thinking, man, it was so informative. I really think I need one of these EPL. Well, are there indicators that a company is at the right stage to bring on someone? Because you don't want to be that sacrificial lamb of coming in too early and the founder's not ready to let go, and it just ends in tears, right? Like what would you say to business leaders to advise them on when to hire you?
Well, I was thinking in response to Jono, there is actually a healthy tension between a founder, CEO, having vision and a sense of urgency and wanting to go fast and actually completely outstripping the team's ability to execute that. And I've had a shoe on both feet in that respect. I used to work with Rob at Te Papa, and when I was CDO and he was managing product development in my group. And I distinctly remember Rob saying to me, you've got to stop talking to the team about this next idea you've got, because they are overwhelmed with the amount of work they've got on right now. And so, you know, as an executive product leader, your job in a way is to filter the vision and the that sense of urgency from the chief exec, which needs to be there. Like, you want a sense of urgency, but actually to then to kind of try and turn that into something that the team can actually execute and that is not creating so many distractions that it's actually slowing you down along the way. So I think that possibly the right time is when the chief executive, if they have been a product CEO, actually needs to focus on bigger concerns about how they actually grow the business, and the minutiae of how you execute product is kind of taking away from their goals, their bigger goals. That's probably the point.
And is there a point where if you were a CPO reasonably early and the founder was still present and in the office, not raising money all over the world, that you can't to what extent can you take over strategy and vision of something that they've probably got a strategy and vision already, and that you might not be quite big enough to disassociate the business strategy with the product strategy? Do you not lean into the strategic piece as much and get to understand why the strategy exists so that you can validate it as you go? Or how do you not make the founder feel like you're taking over every decision that's ever going to be made about the future of their baby? Because that's what they're thinking.
That's interesting. I would see it hand in glove. The product strategy and the business strategy, at least product companies I work for, though they ought to be one and the same, in the sense that how you view and think about your product is just an instrument of executing the business strategy. It goes deeper, and then you're going into like, it should take you all the way into the execution of it, like how you think about your teams and your resourcing. And this is probably where I think the relationship, what I think you pointed to, between that product leading person and the CEO is so critical to, the personal relationship around how you communicate with each other and what kind of understanding you go, because there's just so much natural overlap between the discussions that they obviously are responsible or accountable for and the ones that you are leading kind of on the behalf of in many ways.
So what are you bringing to, so when you and Richard sat down about your role at Totara, he's clearly deeply knowledgeable about the business and the business model and the opportunities ahead. And so he would have had a view of how he thought the product might evolve and the strategy and the vision he had for the product. Is your role adding to that in helping him articulate it? Are you bringing a rigor to that a lot of founders don't have in how they articulate strategy? How do you enhance that without him feeling threatened?
I think, in that particular, and again, I think it's relationship by relationship. So how I work with him was different with how I work with Sam. So it's right. So in that case, it's like catching his vision, like articulate in a way that I was like, man, if we only did this years ago, like it would be quite different because you're bringing a different skill set to it. But also it's like really getting the business of the product and what is it that it does, and then what are our opportunities to do that, and like offering into that conversation. Because what he was really good with is just how to not just think about ways that it could grow, but like how to actually do that and make it grow. And truly an entrepreneurial kind of person in that way, and kind of catching the gap and that sort of thing. And so, that's where he excelled and understood that from the product point. But kind of what you're indicating in terms of gets to a point where it sort of exceeds what he has available to do it, but also ultimately, I think, often desire too, of like there's a point, I think, this is sort of 10 years on for him, where you're in a place of, it's a tough gig to kind of keep in all that level of detail that you need to do, and at some point you want to do other things, and not have that kind of, those things to worry about.
Are there scenarios where you advise a company not to hire an executive product leader, or should you always have one?
No, I would. It's a timing thing. What you were saying before, I think if you've got particularly if you're at the beginning, and your idea is based off a product, like a piece of software technology, that you'll come up with the inception of that idea. I don't think you need that. If honestly, I don't think that's not where my role comes in. My role comes in where you're trying to transform from your startup into scale up, and then how do you make that scale up really scale, and do that in a way where you preserve your people. It's probably like I think an agenda I have is because that can be quite brutal if you're not careful. And so I think it's really that call, and there's so many reasons as to why you're at that step. If you're not the product person to begin with, that's probably the first hire you make, arguably, is your right-hand person of who is actually going to help you understand that. But I would probably bet that's a technologist, not a classic, not what we're saying, product management. I would say someone who really is in the technology space, and that's who I would pick.
So if any of the other three, if you think about the journey that your company's gone on with the order of hires, did they have no product people, then they hired a couple of product owners, then some managers, and then at some point thought, someone needs to manage these people, so I better hire a CPO? Or did they go straight to CPO and then they got the CPO to build out the function? What was the ordering that happened, and did it work?
Eileen's probably got a better idea of how.
Eileen, come on the couch.
What started first? One product manager?
One product manager.
And then two product
Who
managers?
had a hard time.
Who had a hard time.
Because they were very much under the CEO. Maybe a technical section.
Yeah, it's tough being I don't know if they were a new PM, or they'd had experience. But it's tough to be the first, even if you're not the CPO. If you're the first PM, it can be tough as well, right?
Yeah. And then 2 PMs, and then a head of.
How about you, Zheng? What about Raygun?
I was the first PM, and I was hired directly as the director of product at the time. And I think the right time to hire is probably when the CEOs are doing too much themselves. And as a business owner, having built my own business, I certainly see that as well. But I wouldn't say the CPO or the head of product would be the first one I hire, because the founder usually has a very strong vision. Whether it's right or not, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. But they usually have a strong vision. So from a vision or strategy point of view, they don't usually need help that early on. I would say the COO is more important as a second hire, because in my business, you know, I didn't know anything about finance. I had to learn everything, and the COO would have been really, really useful. Would have like 10 times my just took off all of my workload on that side, and I would hire the COO every time as a second hire.
So if someone in the room is looking to aspires to be an executive product leader, would you advise them to look for a scale-up company, or one that's just coming out of their sort of startup roots, have found some market fits, things are starting to take off, maybe they've got a round of funding in? Is that the sort of company to look for that might be a good place to go and work? Or would you want to start your career in a more stable environment where they've at least got some runs on the board and a team that you can work with in day one, so that you weren't rolling your sleeves up entirely? Because I guess if you're the first CPO and there's no product managers, you're doing everything from product ownership right through, right?
I think it depends where you are in your career at the moment. You know, there's that sort of saying about like, agile's broken product management because of the you know, the model of product ownership and agile, and how it sort of doesn't recognise actually all of the business acumen aspects of product management. But I think the critical thing is not just about being able to work in a delivery team and execute product, but actually the commercial acumen to understand how to create the value capture. And so it almost doesn't matter what level you're doing that in the first instance. If you're just continuing to actually grow your level of commercial exposure, that's the first thing. And then it comes down to where can you then actually apply that knowledge to have an impact for a company. And sometimes, I mean, you know, back to the role that I had at the ABC, the digital business unit had almost the most flexibility of any digital product team in the entire organisation, because we were generating revenues, and that meant we had control over. We didn't have as much governance, I suppose, in terms of spending public money. We were spending not public money, and we were working across everything from transforming current businesses, where you learn a lot about that, through to trying to innovate the next horizon, where you're also learning a lot, but they're sort of entirely different things with different sets of activities that you're going to do at each stage. And I think if you're wanting to move into an executive product role, then you've got to understand how to keep the lights on for your core business, while at the same time actually knowing when the right time is to loosen your grip a little bit and to be a bit more scrappy and lean in discovering your next opportunity.
Yeah.
And that requires a bit of flexibility and experience.
Any further thoughts on that? And maybe reflecting on the fact that 60-odd% of people going into these EPO roles have not been a product manager. And do we think that's net good? Are there any challenges with having somebody running a product organization who's never seen it potentially, or doesn't know some of the theory? Or do you think it attracts people who have the business acumen and understand about value generation? And does it surprise you that only 60% of people don't have that background?
They might not have that official background, but I think a lot of people will be moving into these roles that have been in other roles that were kind of doing that function. That would be my guess. I mean, you've got the numbers.
Yeah, I haven't recorded what their backstory is, but a lot of them I think are coming from other executive roles, or certainly very senior roles as previous founders maybe, and what I should do is probably take away from my sample the people who are working in very small companies where they may have just given themselves that title, or it's a different type of role at different stages of the company. If you're and it occurs on at Xero, quite a different scale of product organization than having one or no product managers to manage. And so that she would require a very different set of background skills to be able to operate at that level than someone earlier on. I was originally shocked by it, thinking, how can they run a product organization? How can we create good product culture with people who've never seen it? But I have changed my mind in that I think what they bring to those executive roles is the stuff that's hard to learn and takes experience, like you talk about, in terms of having dealt with and built relationships at that end of the table and understand the business imperatives behind your function. And a lot of the people who come in and are successful actually bring that. And then hopefully they've got some understanding of the role of product and how they can support and grow and be a professional development advisor for the people in their team. But I think that stuff's easier to learn, or you just know it because you've got a business head.
Well, one of the things we haven't really touched on is that at that level, you're a leader of leaders. And that's a very different type of skill. You've got teams of people, but those teams of people have teams of people. And how you move others who move others is a different realm of experience. And we're talking about, well, you've seen a decline in some of these EPL people, right? And a few thoughts as to why that might be over the last couple of years. But part of, well, how do you make yourself indispensable in this role? And if you're got a really strong business acumen, which I would kind of nail it more in like commercial understanding, which is I would say a little bit different in that you've got to like get to a point where you can start dissecting your own P&L and start modeling in your own way, which is like not just mechanics issues of business, but like into that detail where you're really comfortable there and like can interchange then about ideation, but back into that level, then that's a part. And if you can do that and if you've worked on that leadership kind of space, well, and hopefully you've kind of learned how to recruit effectively, then you find the people who actually know that stuff and you learn from them. But those other parts are like what makes you indispensable because you're a really strong business leader.
Yeah.
And the reality, I think, if you don't offer that and all you do is they're an expert at the product level but are missing those things, when your business hits some really crunchy junction of where you want to accelerate, or you had in tough times, now you need a different bag of tricks, and you don't have any underpinning kind of things there. So like I'd say like management principles, like you might, it's kind of just paper stuff, but actually once you start getting in those situations, if you've had some of that more classical training and you realize, right, there's something to some of the theory of like why you need that, but that doesn't get exposed until you kind of hit a degree of complexity. And so if you didn't come up that way, you simply just don't know that you're missing quite an important part of the skill set. And that would be my guess, is to, companies that accelerate really quickly and you just like go up the ranks through the product set, but then hit a point, I think you hit a ceiling of skill where you need to go away again and go, I need to branch out. Maybe I'm not that great at like growing like people after a particular level. Or maybe when it comes to it's like, I just simply don't know enough about the way businesses can function.
Or you might have hit a ceiling of interest.
Yep.
Like you may just go, I really love the craft of product management and being closer to the team and the value generation.
Totally.
I don't want to be over there. It's like engineers, not all engineers want to be CTOs because they go, what, I have to manage people?
Totally. Yep.
Yeah,
and I think, at least in my experience, I didn't actually spend a lot of time in roles that were product roles. Like honestly, it's like maybe a year or two. And I just sort of skipped over that because that wasn't really what I was super strong in doing. I understood it all because I got all the technology and the business side of it.
Yeah.
I work with people who really love that. When you're not, your skill says you're in the same subject matter, but your skills you're deploying are actually very different to those skills. And so if you do really love that and now you're really passionate about that, you're it's generic, but you are a business leader. That's what you're going into. And if you don't love business and you don't love having those conversations and talking about that all the time, that's not the right kind of role. Product is part of your conversation, but so are a whole bunch of the other the screeds of stuff you have to think about when you're operating.
The more I think about product as a discipline is that all we've done is repackaged business.
Yes.
We have different words now that make sense to us because we're all new to business, and now we talk product speak, but it's actually a reframing of business imperative.
With perhaps slightly more of a focus on humans at the end of what you're creating.
Profit. Yeah. Hey, we've got I want to spend a couple of minutes to see if anyone has any questions in the audience that they'd like to ask panelists. Thomas.
There's a segue somewhere around talking about the first heads of product fail that I think Zheng you mentioned. I wonder your reflections on whether you're the first head of products in your respective businesses and how that impacts, or if you have a predecessor who was a head of CPO or whatever, kind of whatever baggage you're picking up from them, or whatever you've got to change, or whatever you've learned from that person before you. Because I know there's a couple of you at least who are the first and kind of forging the path versus just stepping into somebody else's shoes, for example.
If you reframe the question, I don't know whether the mic picked that up. If anyone wants to pick that up.
I mean, yeah, I can talk about it. It was
Do you want to reframe the question?
roughly around if you are the first head of EPL type person in an org, how have you not failed? Basically.
Sure, yeah.
And how do you deal with the baggage left over by someone else who wasn't here, that kind of stuff. So I think somebody is always doing product. It's just it might not be someone with that official title. And I think probably in a lot of early organizations or small ones, it's probably like an engineering type person or the founder. Somebody who has kind of taken that mantle. Often I see it's an engineer because they're kind of in charge of building things. And so they'll work with the founder to figure out what it is, but they'll ultimately go off and build it. And that was definitely the case where I went. And so it was, the baggage wasn't too bad because I could be like, I'm the product person and this is how we're going to do it, rather than the engineer. But taking all the things I don't had and the kind of culture they built up and kind of going, actually, there's a lot of good stuff in here. And then let's just progress that and sort of iterate on. And so that, I guess, not throwing everything out is really important, because you can't just you destroy your culture straight away and all your engineers will leave. But being subtle and influencing it to the right direction. And then also that relationship that that person and our founder had was a different relationship to what I had. And so building on that, and I think it's all about influencing that voice and when you're the first one, and ultimately helping them to let go a little bit of the how the tech's going to get towards the vision that they want it to get towards. They still obviously have this big vision of where we want to go to, and you buy into that and you understand it, and you might want to tweak it a little bit and be like, cool, I see we want to do that, but you're currently going down this path. Have we considered all these other options? But yeah, it's kind of working with them, not throwing everything out, but still being strong enough. I guess you've been hired into this position where you should have a voice, and so you should use that voice.
And especially early on, you're not going to be the smartest person in the room, maybe ever, but not you specifically, Jono. But but you come in and founders that have been living and breathing it forever, and you just rock in. You're just not going to have that context, so you have to be sensitive to that and not be a super threat, thinking you're going to be arrogant.
And you might not know the domain at all, right? I moved from MarTech into health, and they're pretty different. We're just trying to sell anything on one side, and that one we're all about helping people.
Yeah.
So very different context, and funding and the commercial side of it is vastly different.
Yeah.
I would add to, I've been the second twice for 2 CEO founders. So, and that situation, the first person, you are absolutely kicking the rock over. And so if that's an opportunity you have to think about that pretty carefully, because you expose dynamics that the business doesn't even know it has. And I mean, if you know the people really well before this is, and so you've got a good understanding of what some of the curly things will be, great. But if that's a new gig that you're going into, I would be really cautious about that, because you're going to pose and push on a whole bunch of pressure points the business doesn't even understand it really has, particularly if it's a CEO founder who was doing the product. So as the person who's come after a couple of times, you do have some ripples of which you can start. It's like an echo pulse that you are then seeing what the blips were after someone sent it out, and that's really different to go, okay, right, that's what we're working with. Where that first person who comes in sends out the pulse and has no clue what those blips are going to be, and then they have to, now you're responsible for that. And that I think, to respect for the people I follow, that's a very difficult gig to be in. And I would advise people who've got that opportunity. It's exciting, but be aware that that's especially hard, I think.
And I think that could be more or less successful, so depending on the personality of the chief executive. Yeah. So whenever I've taken roles, I've always chosen bosses as well as roles. And my favourite people to work with are generative people who you can kick ideas around with and build a shared understanding. And so if you, like I'm the first CPO at Storypark, Jamie, our chief exec, he's a real learner. He's got a real growth mindset. And so consequently that's made, yes, there have been times when we've had a bit of argy-bargy, but we've always been able to work through that and get to a new and better understanding together. And so I think, if you're choosing to be the first exec product leader in an organisation, really dig into what is the mindset and psychology of the person that you're going to be reporting to.
Okay, I'm just to be fair on the people online, because we've still got 12 people hanging in there. There's questions come through from someone online, and I'm going to paraphrase their question. They, as an EPL, do you come to a company with certain frameworks or possibly ways of working that you would like to roll out to an organisation, or are you more about enabling an environment where those frameworks can be created from within, say, as an alternative approach to that? How much do you dictate down versus?
Totally depends on which aspect of the business you're working in. So when I think about Storypark, for instance, company's 10 years old, it's time to, it's getting into its tweenage years, and that inevitably is going to mean growing pains. There might have been certain mindsets kind of 2 years ago that we need to shift in order to take the next stage of growth and scaling. And so there'll be things to do with how the teams work that you actually want the teams to own, because they've, you don't want them to feel done to. They actually sort of need to have part of their own destiny themselves.
But if you just read Basecamp's Shape Up and thought, man, that's the best thing, and that you didn't want just one team to do that. Is that a good example? Is that your call to say, we're going to do that? Or do you allow the teams to make those decisions?
I guess I've been working in product development for long enough to know that there is no one size fits all, and I have worked with agile coaches who are religious about what they're doing, and at the end of the day, actually you've got a collection of humans, each one of whom is completely different, and you've got to figure out what works for that particular group of humans.
Yeah.
And if that means using, borrowing from some agile principles or borrowing from other principles, great. But, for instance, we are just now moving off Shape Up and into what we are calling lowercase f flow. With the idea that actually we want cross-functional teams to be able to contribute as meaningfully as they can, but also to be speeding up instead of creating many little full cycles.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna call it on the live stream. Thank you so much for being part of a conversation that I certainly find super interesting. That I could keep talking to you guys for a long time, and everyone in the room and online. But thanks for your time and sharing your thoughts on being an EPL.